It is Tuesday at 1 p.m. and that means you are listening to Let's Talk Justice, Jamaicans for Justice radio show talking about our human rights and our social issues here in Jamaica. I am Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Michael Jackson, Executive Director, joining you via at home, but thank you so much for tuning in as usual. And just to remind those who are joining us on Radio Land to keep tuned. And for those who are watching on YouTube, you can watch us via the JFJ YouTube channel. And of course, Bridge 99 has its website. And just reminding that you can call in at 1:30 onwards for the second half of the program at Jake, can you remind me of the number? I just had a brain freeze.
Yes, it's 239-7583 or the studio line at 676-4996.
Okay, thank you so much. Apparently, old age catching up with me. All right, great. Last week, for those who follow our social media platforms, as well as you would have seen articles in the media regarding the HIV reporting form. It's a discussion that we're going to be having today, really digging through what exactly are the issues and how exactly we can raise our concerns collectively to the Minister of Health, because there's no place for discrimination in public health response. So that's a discussion that I ask and urge our listeners to tune into. Anything to add, Jay, before I launch into the human rights recap? We're not beside each other, so I can't follow the non-verbal and the body language.
No, just to say that we'd be joined by two of our partners today to have that discussion.
All right. Last week was a bit of a heavy week for the country. Some good news in all of this. If you recall, we all mourn with the family of young Daniel Rowe, the 8-year-old whose throat was slashed, and we may recall that the Jamaica Constabulary Force had named a person of interest. It became public last week that a woman was brought into custody. And obviously our prayers for those who pray, our condolences, best wishes continue to be with the family. And we do hope that this individual who still remains in custody bears some fruit in opening up the investigation a little bit more, wherein those who are guilty can be brought to justice. So a little bit of an update for those who may not have seen those in the media. Last week also was a tragic one for residents in Portmore. Now, we were burdened with news reports of gangsters and persons with despicable character opening up gunshots and firebombing houses in Gregory Park in Portmore. And as a result, we would have seen the news wherein at least 80 persons, including 30 children, were left homeless. Now, such acts obviously is something we should all shun, condemn as a society, because we ask the question, what could really make people commit such inhumane
atrocities,
actions against citizens? And I listened to the Member of Parliament, Orlando Terrelong, and he made certain calls which I personally reiterate and support. He asked for a permanent police post to be in the vicinity so that you can have ongoing community policing presence in the community rather. He also asked for immediate boots on the ground. But Mr. Terrelong, I think naturally he called for a zone of special operations, and with that comes certain social interventions, which is a call that MP Terrelong made, which we support here at JFJ. For those who are not familiar with these areas in Portmore, you're talking about the usual zinc fencing in some areas. You know, when you go into a particular lane in a community and you feel as if there's no escape route because there's a dead-end road, for example. And these communities, how they're structured, it does not respect the dignity of the citizens who are living there. So MP Terry Long called for a community renewal of sort, where we can see infrastructural development and improvement in these areas. And part of the reasoning for this call is to ensure that it facilitates modern policing. Because even law enforcement officers, if you look at the communities, they are fearful, I'm sure, of entering them because it brings safety concerns for their own lives. So we reiterate that call, and we hope that this is something that the Jamaica Social Investment Fund will be keen on funding. And we have seen where the Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, made a commitment that he will be rebuilding the homes of these individuals. So again, we condemn the act, and clearly the crime in this situation is something we all need to put our energies behind. Last thing to note before I close out, though, while we condemn, I note a language that the Prime Minister used when he was speaking over by Portmore. A preemptive strike is necessary to deal with crime and those who are involved. And the Prime Minister went on to perhaps chastise those who he believes have not been supporting what this preemptive strike may very well be. I hope that we take heed to the sustainable responses that were called for by Member of Parliament Terry Long. Because preemptive strike, with the greatest of respect to our Prime Minister, cannot mean locking up some of the very people whose house we're going to be rebuilding. Because let us not kid ourselves. When we take such approaches that will very well infringe on people's human rights, it's the very minority and vulnerable groups, the poor people in these communities, that you will end up gathering up in trucks and detaining for an extended period of time. So I just want the Prime Minister to be cautious and be cautioned by the responses of civil society that we do support sustainable crime-fighting measures. But the preemptive strike terminology is one for concern when we listen to the Prime Minister. But we support the other mechanisms that the Prime Minister and the police force and MP Terry Long, as well as the PNP caretaker, Raymond Price, would have called for in recent times. Over to you, Jade.
Thank you for that, Mikkel. So, quick recap of all of the major issues that we would have seen. Well, not all, some of the major issues. I know that we'll be going over some of them again in the second half of the show. But before that, I just wanted to give us our Did You Know and trivia of the day. So, starting with our Did You Know, it is coming from our International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And at Article 12, it gives us a right to health, which states that the state parties to that covenant, which Jamaica is one, are to recognize that right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And that provision is supported by further commentary to say that the right to health is related to several other human rights, which would include our right to food and housing, to work, to education, to human dignity, to life, to non-discrimination, equality, and the provision of torture, to privacy and access of information. So the right to health has extended components to it, and some of them might be of issue in today's topic as well. So we'll get into it. We also have our trivia question for today, which is what article of the Constitution protects Jamaicans for discrimination? So I'd like the section and the subsection, please, for those of you who are normally participating on our Instagram. And so I'll ask Mikkel to give us an introduction to today's topic.
All right, the topic is focusing on the HIV reporting form, the challenges and concerns that we have. We're joined by Mr. Patrick Lalor, who is the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, my longtime friend, right? I'm going very informal as I introduce him. And of course, a very, very close friend of mine as well, and Jade and JFJ family, is Miss Renae Green, who is the Executive Director of Transwave Jamaica. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us.
Well, so we are missing Renae. She's on the way. And I think
she's joining in person.
Yes, she'll be joining us in person. And I think that we're calling back Patrick now. We seem to have lost him on the line. But if you don't mind, Michael, what is the history behind this form issue?
So just to bring things in context, the HIV reporting form is a tool, a data collection tool that is important in public health. It's a form that would capture critical socio-demographic factors about individuals who test for HIV. So when you go to a public health or a private facility, because you want to analyze our risk factors so while you should all get your HIV test while you're sexually active, if it is that you have multiple sex partners, for example, and you have various sexual proclivities that you may partake in, then that sort of data will be asked of you when you're getting tested. And that is really to conduct what we call a risk assessment. And it will help with counseling and say, okay, you may want to use a condom and so on. You may want to reduce your number of sexual partners, whatever the counselor may deem appropriate. Now, this type of information, once it is gathered, and if it is that you test positive for HIV, then it is that anonymously certain data is turned over and analyzed for public health purposes. It will give the country and the public health authorities through the Ministry of Health an idea how to tailor the HIV program that is responsive to those who are most at risk. It will give us an idea as programmers, for example, how exactly do we respond to your needs? So here at JFJ, we are part of the HIV response. And what we do is to ensure that people who are affected by discrimination when they engage in the public health facilities with law enforcement, then we provide our legal support services. And this came as a result of the different data that were collected in the HIV reporting form and other data collection tools. Now, recently, the person who is at the Love March movement, I think Dr. Daniel, his last name escapes me at the moment.
Yes.
He went on what I can only call a TikTok rant to say, what kind of information is this collecting about people's gender identity? So beyond the biological sex or male or female, if it is that you identify as a woman, for example, but you were born a man, then that information would be captured, not only because it is respectful of persons' choices, but because it also captures your risk factors for contracting HIV. So this individual from Love March movement went on a rant on TikTok. Apparently, our Minister of Health, Dr. Christopher Tufton, I don't know if it is that he saw the TikTok ranting, but we heard and we saw a press release thereafter saying that the form will be so amended and reviewed to be in keeping with the Constitution of Jamaica. And then to the society, we met and we wrote an open letter raising our concerns. And you can summarize those concerns, Jane.
Yes, and I appreciate that introduction, Michael. But we're going to take the break now first, and then when we come back, I'll give some of the key points from the letter. And Patrick is on, so maybe Patrick can assist me with summarizing some of those issues when we return from the break. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. Today we are ventilating some of our challenges and concerns with the proposed change to the HIV reporting form. We're joined by Mr. Patrick Lalor, the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life. And we are being joined very shortly by Miss Renae Green, the Executive Director at Transwave. So before the break, I was just about to summarize some of the key points from the open letter that the Civil Society Forum would have sent to Minister of Health, Dr. Tufton, where we asked several questions. For example, why there would have been a lack of collaboration with civil society groups who we would have had a history of collaborating with the ministry regarding these issues. Patrick, do you want to ventilate some of the other concerns that came out in the letter?
Sure, Jade. Thanks for having me. Hi, Michael. How are you? Afternoon to your listeners. Well, there are three key questions that we asked, which would, while later on in the discussion, I could get in more detail. We, based on the release from the ministry, the first question as a civil society forum we wanted answered was, what really prompted this sudden call for the review of the data collection form for HIV epidemiological data? Why was there a call for the review of it? As I heard Michael say in the introduction, there was this TikTok video by this Love March movement person. I don't want to jump to any conclusion to assume that prompted the review. So we are asking, what prompted this review? And based on what we saw in the release from the ministry, what we cannot put our hands on is what exactly on the HIV confidential reporting form actually violates the Jamaican constitution. And then what legal structures, as the release from the ministry said, what legal structures of the government does the forum fail to comply with? We as a forum, the forum comprises of entities that for the most part work in HIV and has been a key partner of the Ministry of Health over the years in realizing some of the significant gains we have seen in HIV prevalence in Jamaica and the control of HIV in terms of reducing new infections and getting people who are already infected to a level where they are not at risk of passing HIV on to any other person. So we consider ourselves very critical in the fight against HIV in Jamaica, and we really found it interesting that such a review would be taking place, and there was no consultation with any of the entities that have been key partners in the ministry over the years in the fight against HIV.
Oh, thank you so much for that ventilation, Patrick. That was very succinct and brought out a lot of the key points. I am now joined by Renae from Transwave in studio. So, Renae, I don't know if you want to just give us your initial reaction to the release and what are some of the major concerns coming from Transwave side.
Well, I think for me it was kind of shocking, particularly because it took a number of years for the forum to have the information that it had, right? And I think one of the critical things for me was just how it made no sense in terms of the justifications that were given for the form being changed back. Particularly because, there's nothing on the form that says anything about, people not being able to identify with a specific gender or not. All it did was just ask how people identified. It didn't force anyone to, take on an identity that they already didn't have. And so for me, it was very strange, and it just came out of left. And it was disheartening because it took so long to be able to get the forums to request that type of information.
I just wanted to add, what is the value of that information to Transwave?
I mean, not just Transwave, but like the trans community in general, particularly because trans people are particularly predisposed to HIV and AIDS. Okay. And of course, just the general health risks associated with being a part of the trans community is why that data is so important. Because of stigma and discrimination, trans people already are driven underground and to, already not having access to healthcare, and as well as a myriad of other things. This information became important because then the question of, do trans people actually exist within Jamaican,
In
if
the
trans people
society,
do
right.
exist, what are some of their health needs and health concerns? And globally, trans people are at risk, are at much higher risk of HIV than any other group, but we're also predisposed to violence more than any other group. And we're also predisposed to discrimination, especially in health spaces, more than any other group. And requesting this information helps to track the amount of trans people that exist, but also is able to track our concerns and our needs and make it a lot easier, to address our particular health concerns and risks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renae. I just want to jump in because, I'm listening to Renae articulate all the issues that they're completely correct. But I'm also cognizant that we have people who are listening on this call who themselves suffer through an inability to appreciate differences and diversity. So let me quickly jump in here to say, while persons within the trans community are affected, so too the data will be collected for heterosexuals who participate in anal sex. So too the data is important for young women and young boys who are sexually abused, because again, it's risk factors we're talking about. So too the data for those who believe that religion protects them from contracting HIV, because we have our one husbands and our one wives, our one husband, one wife. Let me correct before my English teacher in high school have a fit. But the reality is that we are affected by different risk factors, some of us more than others. And it's the very inability to appreciate differences and diversity that make gay men and persons within the trans community to be violated by stigma and discrimination in different ways, where people can't truly express who they are. So I want to put that in context for those who are listening in, right? That I want us to put aside those biases that we have and think from a public health perspective. Because once you have a group of people who have to go underground and hide who they are, the level of prevalence of HIV in this country will go right back up. So I want to put that in context. And to segue to a question to you, Patrick, the minister said something in his release, or the Ministry of Health, that somehow this reporting form violates the Constitution and other statutory laws in this country. What is the response to such an assertion? And I would withhold my own personal view at this moment and just ask you to share your perspective.
Michael, I would not want to get into the minister's mind, as I have no such abilities. But from my reading of the Constitution, I am at a loss as to what exactly does having gender and allowing people to identify as they identify on a data collection form. I really don't see how that breaches the Constitution, but maybe I missed the minister's point. Maybe it's something else. And that is why one of the questions we ask is what exactly? Because we have looked through the Constitution. We have had to do it over and over in our everyday work, but we have even gone back to look since this release. And we failed to see what exactly in the Constitution is breached by this. So we stand ready for that to be clarified for us. But in addition, Michael, I want to go back to something that you said about people not accepting difference. I remember back in 2014, 12 offenses and related.
Seem to be
behalf of the organization. When there were people...
If you could just repeat. Since you remember in 2013, 2014?
Right. When the sexual offences and related acts were up before the Parliament for review, we made submissions, and one of the groups that came up for question, I am just making this point to show the issue of difference, were sex workers. And there were people who feel that because soliciting for the purpose of prostitution was an illegal act, services, health-related services, shouldn't be provided to sex workers. We vehemently defended our position of providing same services to sex workers, and the church was one of the groups that stood strongly against this. And it's the same position that they took. Yes, I'm in church and I have my one wife or one husband, whatever the case may be. One of the points I made back then is that we have husbands in the church who do business with sex workers. It was not taken lightly by the church back then, and I'm sure it won't be now. But it was a reality we have had to face. When I started working in HIV, the better part of a decade ago, the prevalence rate among sex workers of HIV, and I'm giving you this data to prove a point, was 12.5%. Just a little over a decade ago. 12.5%. You know what is the prevalence rate now? It is less than 2%.
Absolutely.
It is 1.8% today as we speak. And I'm quoting data from the said Ministry of Health. And these are groups that we would have people, because of their differences, sit aside and say, why not providing service to those groups? What, am I encouraging them to do this and encouraging them to do that? No. So this position can absolutely not be tolerated, because when you talk about data gathering for health surveillance and epidemiology, we have to ensure that we know where diseases, virus, bacteria, whatever is affecting us is concentrated, and offer this service there. And in doing so, there is absolutely no law that is being broken. And if we think we are going to ignore particular groups because we feel differently about them, then we are only opening the rest of the population up to, we are just leaving an epidemic to break out and a lot of people to get sick. If you think, because I don't like a particular group, I am going to totally cut them out, I'm not going to include them in data collection, I'm not going to provide services for them. So we have to be careful.
Thank you so much for that, Patrick.
A very thin line.
I'm going to have to stop you there. We do have to take the break now, but I want you to stay with us because we have to ventilate some more concerns. And I know that Renae wanted to add to the point you were just making regarding constitutionality and issues with the legislation. So we'll take the break, and when we come back, we'll pick up with Renae and then you, Patrick. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are discussing the proposed changes to the HIV reporting form, some of our concerns and challenges. We are joined by Ms. Renae Green, the Executive Director of Transwave, and Mr. Patrick Lalor, the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life. Before the break, Patrick was giving us a very useful rundown of what some of the changes, the impact that some of the changes to the HIV form that we had made before would have had. And I know Renae wanted to make a point on the inconsistency with the Constitution issue that came up in the release from the Ministry of Health.
You know, I think one of the things that people misconstrue all the time is this notion that being queer or LGBT is illegal in Jamaica, and it isn't. What the law says is illegal is what we call buggery, which is the act of penetration. And of course, we know that there's a specific definition, and so it has to meet that criteria, right? Being gay or LGBT isn't actually illegal. And so, therefore, which still, in my opinion, should not have, even if it was, shouldn't have a bearing in terms of how a person is able to access their basic right to healthcare. I think what is happening with this conversation is that people are using their own personal beliefs and the fact that a lot of Jamaicans don't understand the law and how it works to kind of create this sense of hysteria and panic, and then use that as justification to discriminate against groups or people that they don't necessarily believe should be in existence because of their own religious or personal beliefs. And to me, when we're talking about health, what we should be talking about is what is necessary for people to be able to live holistic lives and healthy lives, and not, whether or not I believe that this person is going to go to heaven or not. That should not be the bearing for a person's ability to access healthcare. And I think that's what's been happening. People using their religious and personal beliefs to decide who should have access to what, even though trans people, LGBT people, other, this affects everyone. Because to me, I'm agreeing with Mikkel. It is, of course, not just an issue that affects trans people alone.
Right.
And this form and how it collects its data doesn't only impact the trans community. It's a wider issue. It's a broader issue. And of course, people within the health sector collect this data to ensure that the services that they're providing, that the healthcare that they're providing actually is beneficial to the groups of people who need it. And so, I feel like the conversations that we need to be having now is, whether or not there really is a separation of church and state. And really, if people's religious bearings should have such a valid impact on how people are able to live healthy lives within this country and how those beliefs affect our health systems. And I think those are the conversations we need to be having.
And I want to ask you a question. There is a tweet here from Alexis Goff, a human rights advocate. He would have been with the JFJ team in different capacities over the years, and we meet from time to time on specific issues. He made a tweet, and let me read. He says, Christian fundamentalist and fascist groups are well organized and winning, and centrist advocates and NGO staff counter this by laughing at them, practicing respectability, and sucking up to the very politicians who support the Christian fundamentalist and fascist agenda. That's a tweet from Alexis Goff. And you made a statement earlier about the need of separating church and state, which, based on my historical knowledge, would have happened from the Enlightenment period. But what else can advocates do? Because when you are organized, there are certain lines that you have to maintain. But are we so guarded, as Alexis said, with respectability, wherein, and fear perhaps of maybe facing backlash where we perhaps bring our efforts a few years backwards? But are we doing enough with advocacy on matters such as these? The fact that we're having a conversation of this nature in August 2023, what else can we do differently, Renae?
So I agree with Alexis, actually. I do think over the years we've gotten, I don't want to say complacent, but I will say the fear of coming off as combative, and of, public backlash, or even, backlash from even our politicians in terms of them not wanting to engage, I think has overpowered how we do our work in this space. And so we've taken a more backseat approach where we try to sensitize, we try to, do the public education.
Advocacy.
Right. But I do think we're getting into a dispensation where, as Alexis has said, the right-wing groups are very much far more radical than we are, and they're saying what they want to say and caring zero for who gets offended by it or not, and they don't care of coming across as combative because they're standing firm in what they believe in, and they're winning because of it. And so therefore the advocacy that we've been practicing clearly needs to change to fit the dispensation that we're in now, and that dispensation is being a little bit more aggressive and being a little bit more forthright in not only combating the negative and very much false information that's being spread, but also making sure that our leaders understand that they owe us a duty as well, and they have a responsibility to us as well as law-abiding citizens in this country to protect us and to also ensure that we have access to our fundamental rights and freedoms.
Yes.
And so I definitely think we have to improve there. No. I'm just saying I definitely think we have to change how we've been operating, and we do need to start taking the fight to them and not being so afraid to have the uncomfortable conversations, because these are uncomfortable topics because we're challenging a system that has existed for centuries.
Yes.
But we do need to challenge these systems so that we can progress as a people, and so that everyone who lives in this country can have access to the same things as everybody else. Because for some reason, they also assume that LGBT people want special rights, and that's not what's happening at all. What we're saying is we should be able to go to a clinic if we have a cut or if we have something that's wrong with us, and have the same access as everyone else without being treated in a particular way. And that is, to me, is not an unfair ask. And so we need to, as a movement, stop being so apologetic for existing and stop allowing other people to write our narratives, and as well as combating those narratives when they come out, because that's also important, because we need people to know that what they're saying about us isn't true, and this is the facts, and we need to lead with that, and also demand from our leaders that they need to hear us, because we vote as well. I vote every election. I vote.
Yes.
And so therefore,
Renae,
yes, I vote. I have an MP and I vote.
Yes.
Right. And so clearly it means I need to also, as a voter, need to reevaluate the people I'm voting for, because they clearly don't have my best interest as a Jamaican citizen at heart. And those are the things that we need to be talking about.
Yes, I know Mikhail wanted to say something, but one of the challenges that I had with Dr. Daniel, can't remember his last name right now, Love March Movement, was he used the term, what are the Jamaican taxpayers, basically what are their taxpayer money expected to be doing? And it kind of assumes that the groups that he's challenging don't pay taxes, that we are not they're not participatory citizens in the country. And I think that is also an unfair assumption that should be challenged. Mikhail?
You know, one of the things, Jade, and one of the reasons I'm proud to be leading from the front at JFJ with our team, and Renae said it well, you can't be apologetic when it comes to people's fundamental rights. So we're not saying combative is the initial response with everything, to be clear for our listeners. But I don't think a woman, for example, who is from a low income status should be apologetic for her rights to sexual and reproductive health care, should be apologetic asking our parliamentarians to remove the savings law clause to facilitate access to safe abortion. I don't think our men should be apologetic to parliamentarians when they go in parliament and talk nonsense to say that the Buggery law and savings law clause should have to be reviewed and be put to a referendum so that our men can get an equal opportunity to be recognized that they can also be raped. So there is a time for soft advocacy where we do the training and we guide and we go to parliament and we present our facts. But when they not listen, then we have to dig deep and say maybe we have to go back to the days where we do peaceful, let me use the word peaceful protest. Yes?
Yes.
Patrick, from your end, what is the proposed next step? You think in having all of this heard and ventilated, because to the best of my knowledge, we haven't heard back from the Ministry of Health. But what is the proposed next step you think that is important?
All right. So, well, one, we would hope to get a response from the minister. But of course, that will not stymie the efforts if that is not forthcoming. So we are anticipating getting a response from the minister, but if not, then the forum as a collective intends to go back to the table and decide what our advocacy initiative is going to be. But definitely what I can say, we will be doing something next to ensure that this backward step is not taken. And I mean, if it means there's always the trying of this soft approach to start, and we hope to get a favorable response from that. But there are other approaches that we will be willing and open to look at taking if we do not get a response, a favorable response from the ministry. The reality is, Mikkel, the gains that we have made in the control of HIV in Jamaica over the years are too significant for us to let go. When we can sit here now and say we have a 62% reduction in new infections in Jamaica, we cannot sit back and just allow the feeling of a few misguided persons to just let all of this go up in flames. So we definitely will not be sitting idle. We are anticipating the minister's response, and if not, we will be taking our next steps to ensure that the gains that we have made are not rolled back. The reality is civil society, the members of the forum have been key partners of the ministry over the years and have contributed significantly to the successes. So we cannot sit back and allow it to be eroded.
Yes.
Thank you
so much, Patrick. Appreciate it. Renae, last words before we have to dig into some other public interest matters. So unless you want to keep Jade company while I'm moved here on Zoom, but we're going to be talking about DPP and other issues. So last word on this particular point. And Jade, over to you to close out on this here.
My last word on this is that regardless of your personal beliefs and how you think people should be, the fact is we're all human, we're all people, and we are all deserving of the opportunity to live the best lives that we can. Access to healthcare allows for that to happen. And so I'm not asking you to accept anything about me. What I'm asking you to do, though, is to respect the fact that I am a Jamaican, I'm a human being, and I deserve at least access to a space that provides healthcare that is free from stigma and discrimination.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that last word, Renae. So we are, and thank you for joining us. Right? So we are about to go into our last segment of the show, where we discuss some other key issues that have been affecting the country in terms of human rights, in terms of policy and social issues. I know that Mikkel mentioned some of them on our advertisement for today's show. I don't know if you want to start out the discussion, Mikkel.
Please, there are a couple of things, Jay, that we continue to follow up on. And let us start with the most recent pressing issue. Last week, we had Mr. Hugh Wildman, attorney at law, on our program. And for the listeners' own edification, you would recall that Mr. Wildman had challenged the Director of Public Prosecution's first extension. That matter was not successful in court. And Mr. Wildman has since appealed. We got that written document from Mr. Wildman when he was on the show last week.
Yes.
And there are several reasons for the appeal, all of which I don't remember readily. But what is important here, beyond Mr. Wildman's appeal, there were thoughts, and we discussed it on the program, whether or not this extension by virtue of the constitutional amendment would so apply to the DPP. And we asked the question because the DPP would have met the age of retirement that was in the Constitution before age 60 and would have gotten an extension. Only one is allowed per the Constitution. So can it be retroactively given is something that is in the news cycle. And for those who are following the news, you would have heard where the People's National Party, that is the parliamentary opposition. The opposition leader is in the Constitution of Jamaica. So let's put aside politics for a minute.
Yes.
Well, not on this program. We don't discuss politics here. We discuss public interest. But for those who are listening in, put aside your political garbs for a minute and think. The opposition is there as the parliamentary check and balance. So they are challenging that constitutional amendment for various reasons. And it begs into question, why are we putting the country and the office through this sort of disarray? What is the thought process behind it? I hear people saying, why we are not talking about the AG? The AG is in her early 50s to the best of my knowledge, and would benefit in no way from this amendment at this time. There is a constitutional reform committee, and I have to put that in perspective. And I think at this stage, JFJ is calling for the Attorney General to speak on this matter publicly and indicate to the country whether or not this constitutional amendment would so benefit the current DPP. Rather than having this thing swirling and attorneys on social media debating, we would like to hear from the Attorney General on this matter. We would also like to hear from the DPP whether or not she would like to continue in the post, if it is so allowed. Because if not, it is important at this stage that a transparent process commences to have the office continue without this sort of controversy surrounding it. I'm not sure, Jade, if you have anything to add to that before we move on to some of the other issues.
No, Mikhail, that was very succinct. I support all of your statements on that, and we look forward to hearing what the proposal for the future of the office really is considering the new amendment.
Yes, because it can't just be that the Prime Minister is saying it's up to the DPP. That's insufficient. But you know, another thing we didn't put on our intended topic. Daniel Archer, close colleague again of ours, partner from the National Integrity Action. If you recall, listeners, civil society, 13 organizations wrote to the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. And the minister did not acknowledge that open letter at all. The permanent secretary, who we speak and have a very good collegial relationship, he responded via email, not in a letter format, to specific issues. Not all of them officially, I'm saying, because as much as we respect that collegiality, we have to be transparent with what has happened.
Yes.
Minister PS responded, Wayne Robertson responded to say, we got the correspondence. This is what will happen. I think he had indicated, Jade, if you recall, that the minutes would be available.
Yes.
Live streaming is going to be considered and so on. Those were the only issues, but to show you that nothing substantively was responded to. We had conversations among us to say whether or not we should not go before the Constitutional Reform Committee. JFJ, we were to write, and we should have written to the minister as a follow-up, because again, no substantive response was in fact forthcoming. Because of other commitment and competing priorities, we did not finalize that letter. NIA, as an independent organization, decided to move ahead. And they wrote to the minister to say, listen, you did not give us due respect as a civil society organization in responding to us. And these are real concerns we have. What budget you have? What is supporting the secretariat? Is free with business this constitution? No response. What is happening? This is not a cabal where you're there in private, secret, dealing with issues. How do we not know what discussions are shaping our constitution? And NIA decided that they're going to boycott, rightfully so. JJ is taking another approach. Once we finish our submission, which is being reviewed internally, we will present to the CRC. That is JFJ's approach. And we will make our issues and concerns known. But we support NIA's independent decision at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Our civil society rep, Dr. Nadine Spence, responded on Nationwide to indicate that the CRC and its members are being bullied by NIA and civil society. We maintain a good relationship with Dr. Spence, we do. But on this, Dr. Spence, you are wrong. Mm-hmm. You are wrong. It cannot be that civil society is making their issues known and we're treating that respectful dialogue, that is, as bullying. And I want to say here that we have had no engagement officially with any member of the Constitutional Reform Committee, including Dr. Spence, who is a civil society representative. We have had 2 brief WhatsApp conversations, and we continue to maintain respectful dialogue. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that would be sufficient enough to say that dialogue has happened. So, Dr. Spence, we maintain good relationship. We appreciate you and your views at all times. But on this, you are wrong. The Constitution of fluid business as every single Jamaican, and it cannot be done in secret. And if it is that the CRC and its secretariat misses a deadline, that ought to be updated. It cannot be that after 13, 14 meetings held to date, only 3 minutes have since been made public. It cannot be that a discussion of this nature, again, is not public. If you can discuss budget and so on PBC, I will see it. Why Constitutional Reform Committee discussions can't be held private? So I think we have to take stock and realize that this response, it's not a personal one at all. Because again, we maintain good relationships, some of us in different spaces. But when we deem the other to be wrong, I think we have to call it out. Jade, I'm very distraught over the response, as you can pick up, because I found it to be quite disappointing and disheartening when I saw it.
Yes.
I'm not sure what your reaction was like when you saw it.
I'm a passionate person. So my initial reaction was quite surprised by how reductive that response was. Because as you would have said, I think that we went the respectable route in trying to air our concerns with the committee and to be engaged in a fulsome manner with the committee. And I think it is certainly unfair for our engagement to have been characterized as any sort of negative or harassment-like behavior, considering the ways in which we engaged with the committee. And I think it is reductive the way that we've been responded to, because it indicates that, and I don't know if this is true, but it indicates that there's a lack of interest in having a transparent process that is inclusive.
Certainly undermines it, yes.
Yes. So I'm hopeful that we will see some improvement in this engagement, and I, as you, support NIA in their decision to boycott the process, and we hope to try to influence the process in the way that we can as JFJ.
Yeah, certainly. And just so we won't have the time to go into it, because I think I just have about 15 seconds. But just to quickly say, less than, yes. We are aware of the fact that 6 parliamentarians are currently under investigation by the Integrity Commission. Mm-hmm. We are also aware that there's a gag order that prevents the Integrity Commission from naming those 6 parliamentarians. But I also recall, and I read it here, that Greg Christie, Executive Director of the Integrity Commission, in the annual report, posed a question that I found most interesting. Mm-hmm. What if members of the Oversight Committee are the ones under investigation? Mm-hmm. Clear conflict of interest. Yes. And we're urging those members to step aside. You cannot be sitting on the oversight committee that is also reviewing in part the Integrity Commission, because some of them are also on the Joint Select Committee. Clear conflict of interest. I think it's inappropriate, ill-advised, and I would ask those individuals to name themselves, because this is an example of why the gap order should be lifted, where there are processes in place that facilitates carefully, depending on the necessity of naming individuals. Not willy-nilly naming, no, but necessity here. So I want to call on those people, and the Prime Minister, if you're so advised of who those individuals are, and the leader of opposition, if you're so advised, please tell your people to step aside. It's the right thing to do, I would say. Yeah.
All right. Yes. So hopefully we'll get to articulate our position more fulsomely somewhere else, maybe on Twitter. But I want to thank you all for joining us. We are completely out of time. We will be back next week at 1 p.m. I'm Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice. And Mikel Jackson, the Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice, was on Zoom. And we will be back, both of us in studio next week.